Hello, encouragers. I'm so excited to be with you today. And boy, I have a real treat, a great friend, former colleague, and a sister in Christ. I really am excited to introduce to you Celia King. Celia, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie.
Celia, why don't you just start briefly with a little bit about yourself? Tell us who you are, a little bit about the journey that has brought you to this point.
Well, right now I am helping executives figure out what to do with their teams, sometimes what to do with their careers. I'm with Arrants McSwain Leadership Development. It's a company I started, 7, 8 years ago now, after you and I had been working at Malone for all those years. The idea being that so much of what we were doing with college students was leadership development. And I had gotten myself in a role at Malone that I liked a lot, but it was really administrative. And I just didn't have the contact with students that I used to have. And this gave me a way to talk about the things I wanted to talk about in terms of helping people understand what they had to offer in their particular leadership role that freed me up to do that. So that's what I've been up to.
Wow, that sounds very familiar, by the way.
I thought it would ring true to
I
you.
just made a transition, and it wasn't exclusively that, but it was very similar. That I started there, as an instructor, and I know you've spent time in the classroom, and we both got our start that way. But yeah, the administrative side of that, and just the kind of from my perspective in athletics, the business side of it too was really, it was great. It was very challenging, but it wasn't quite the right fit for me. And the sad thing is that I knew that real early on, and I just sort of put my head down and plowed through it for, about 11 years. And so when the opportunity finally kind of came to step back away from that, that's what I did. But anyway, how about a little bit more personally? I sensed a little Southern accent. Where are you from? Tell us
Uh,
about you.
Born and raised in South Carolina, but
Awesome.
ended up here in Canton, Ohio with that job at Malone. So I started working in higher ed. One of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about in my work is how do you take all these big ideas that people study about and write books about and make it so that it's tangible for people to actually put into action and put into place. And that, in fact, that's where the name of my company comes from, back all the way to those roots. I was named after grandmothers, also from South Carolina, who, of course, never went to college, but were really intelligent and capable people. So for me, always the question is, these ideas that you're studying and thinking about, do they have legs? I mean, does it really work when you're working with people and with your team?
Absolutely. Yeah. And then let me, I will surprise you with this, but I love just some of the value statements that you have on your website, arrantsmcswain.com. Every person has intrinsic value and should be treated that way. Problems within a team can be solved. Strong leaders take responsibility for their inner life, and the leader's responsibility is to set up each member of their team for success. What a wonderful set of values that you have. One of those kind of big conceptual things that you're talking about and bringing down into some bite-size or more manageable, applicable, practical ways is the Myers-Briggs Type Index.
Yeah.
MBTI. I've mentioned it on the podcast a couple times to my listeners, and really what prompted me to reach out to you and want to talk about this is everyone's interest in that. And it kind of leads back into the third point of your value statement, in that strong leaders take responsibility for their inner life, in essence, to get to know yourself well enough. And the Myers-Briggs assessment index has been really, really helpful for me, for Wendy, for those of us that, have been exposed to it. So you and I happen to live about 200 meters from each other, but we are doing this actually through Zoom. And but it's great to be your neighbor. And so I just really appreciate you stepping in here and helping us as, encouragers, as positive, upbeat, leaders to really take a great assessment and, like I said, bring it down into some manageable chunks. And so many of our listeners probably know about it, or they know of this assessment, but put it into your words as you introduce it to someone. What is the Myers-Briggs Type Index, and maybe even a little bit about, these four areas, these four, continuums or contrasts that, it consists of?
Well, I'll give you a little history on it, which you might find interesting. Myers and Briggs are a mother-daughter team who somewhere in the 1940s discovered Carl Jung's theory that he called psychological type. And in his theory, he said we all have these 8 things that our brain does. 4 ways we take in information, 4 ways we evaluate that information or come to conclusion. And they just thought, wow, if people really understood this and how they most naturally use each of these 8 processes, what a game changer. So they were thinking in the 1940s about really big thoughts like world peace. They were thinking about women headed into the workforce and trying to find work that matched their most natural giftedness. And in fact, the first book they wrote was titled Gifts Differing. That's old King James language that is quoting Romans chapter 12. So from the very beginning, they were trying to help people figure out how is it that you're most naturally wired? And then how do you work in a way that you can use those strengths? And then to borrow Carl Jung's thought, he said, if you've developed all of these things equally, you've developed nothing. What you've got to figure out is what's most natural to you, and then have the wisdom to know when to use the least natural processes. And so they have this inventory. They wrote the inventory, took them decades to get it sorted out. They released it in the 1960s. It's been the most used inventory of its kind since then. About 1 million a year are given and worked through.
Wow.
So if you take it, you end up being given at the end of it, a 4-letter type code. And so there's 16 possibilities. And that 4-letter type code literally tells you something about how you use each of those 8 processes. A lot of people will think about it because of how the type code works. In the 4 letters, the first pair is you're either E or I, second is either S or N, T or F, J or P, all the way through. And some people will think about the Myers-Briggs as I am either this letter or that letter, but really when you go back to their original thought, it's so much richer than that. Because the letter doesn't say you're this letter, not that one. The letter says, oh, this is how you most naturally use each of these processes. So I wondered if maybe we could talk through, you said you were ENFP, maybe we can talk through that one a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the first one, I appreciate you pointing it out that you're not either or, because I think that's what sometimes folks get hung up on, right? They don't want to be either or, and for good reason, because they see themselves in different situations. You know, like for instance, I will go back to me, I'm certainly extroverted, but I'm a particular type of extrovert in that, like I heard it once said that even during this time of COVID and quarantine and, you know, would you rather be, 7 days without any people interaction or 7 days with no interaction by yourself? Which is the worst of those things for us? And to be honest, I'm fine being by myself. I think the extrovertism in me is that I love to be up front, like I would lead, and certainly of my music ability and leading worship and being up front and giving a speech or teaching a class. But I'm not really an extrovert that has a ton of friends. Like I have more acquaintances that are out there. So I really see this as a sliding scale in certain situations. And so why don't we start with your explanation of the extrovert versus introvert kind of process? What would be the way you would explain that to a group?
Yeah, that's really a good question, because right now people are doing a lot of talking about extroversion and introversion. In fact, some people will be familiar with Susan Cain's book, and she has a great TED Talk on this too, and it's called Quiet. And then there's some really interesting subtitle that I can't come up with off the top of my head, something about the power of introverts. And so we all of us want to make sense of organized things, so we're trying to figure out which categories we are. Even though the Myers-Briggs uses the words extrovert and introvert, it's not the best tool for sorting that out. What the Myers-Briggs means when we talk about extroversion and introversion is where our attention is focused. So I told you that it tells you something about 8 processes.
Yes.
Half of the processes are extroverted. And when we talk about it in this context, what we mean is half of those processes have their attention focused outside of ourselves. Half of those processes have our attention focused inside ourselves. So every single person has 4 extroverted processes and 4 introverted processes. And that's where we feel that push-pull in us. Like, well, sometimes I'm focused externally. Sometimes I'm focused internally. If you have an E in your type code, chances are you're going to be more energized by an external processes.
Yep.
And if you have an I in your type code, more energized by that internal process. But you have and you use both, and you should.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
No doubt. And so that's the first set of letters. Let's talk about this now, the S, the sensing versus more intuitive. Go through that same analysis there with those two.
Sure. What those processes are looking at is how it is that you most naturally take in information. If you have an S in your type code, you're probably really natural at noticing concrete things. Some people will notice concrete things externally, like using those 5 senses. They are aware of a sound out the window or what the temperature is in the room. Some people are more comfortable taking those concrete details internally. So they are very good at remembering details and pulling from the past to make sense of things. So if you have an S in your type code, you're probably leaning on that concrete side. If you have an N in your type code, you probably are taking in information much more abstractly, much more conceptually. Some people are doing that externally. So for example, ENFPs are probably taking in information in a way that their mind works almost like a spider web. People with that type code tell me they feel like they have one thought and then have 5, 6, 7 thoughts, feels like all at the same time. The other way that we use that intuitive way of thinking is more internally. So sometimes people will take in a concept, an abstract thought, and want to have some real rich, overarching theoretical construct to make sense of it in. But intuitive processes tend to be more abstract and conceptual.
Right. That's very good. That's really helpful. Now, the third category or the third pair here is more of a thinking versus a feeling. Explain that category now for us too. And how is it different from the sensing and intuitive kind of thing?
Yeah, when you get to that third pairing, the T or the F, you're looking at the most natural way you have for evaluating information or coming to conclusion. And I want to be very clear about the words thinking and feeling. Sometimes we associate thinking with intelligence and feeling with emotion. Myers-Briggs cannot tell you anything about your intelligence. Thinking means that you're more natural with and prefer using logic. We all have and we all use logic. Feeling is more about harmony. I should also tell you that your ability to work with emotions and be an emotional person is true for all 16 type codes. Emotions is a human experience, not a Myers-Briggs experience.
Yes.
Your type code probably tells you something about how you communicate your emotion, but it can't tell you if you're emotionally stable, or sometimes people want to use the phrase more or less emotional. You are emotional. That's just human experience. So here's what that means. If you have a T in your type code, you will more likely want to make and be more natural with making decisions based on logic. Sometimes that's an external logic, like you want to say, well, what's the rules, the policy, the procedure? Somebody come up with some sort of structure that we can pull from. Or you may be wanting to use your own internal logic. Maybe you want to make sense of it on your own. Like, okay, well, I see the rules, but here's what I think would be best based on that. And then if you're more natural using the feeling processes, if you have an F in your type code, you're paying attention to harmony. Sometimes that's external harmony, so making a decision based on how it will affect other people. Sometimes it's internal harmony, trying to make decisions based on your core values and what feels right for the particular situation. And of course, we all have and we use all of these processes to make decisions, but your type code can tell you which one of those is most natural to you.
Yeah. And then finally, we get to the last pair, which is more of a J, judging, or P, perceiving. Tell us about that.
Just like thinking and feeling, I wish we had a different word than judging. Sometimes that makes people want to, that's not what it means. It's not like, don't judge me. It's more like using judgment. We all want to use sound judgment and wise judgment. But people with the J in their type code tend to want to be working towards a thing. They want to know what the outcome is. Now, whether that is making a decision based on structure and rules, or whether it's based on an absolute certainty that there will be group harmony as we move along, they tend to think and work in a conclusion sort of way.
Yes.
People with a P in their type code tend to be more interacting with the world based on taking in information. Like, well, let's see what else we can find out. And the process is usually more interesting than conclusion. I love to, when I'm with groups, divide them up based on somebody who, like, oh, I think I'm more natural with the J process. I think I'm more natural with the P. And then ask them to talk about goals. What are goals for? Typically, people with a J in their type code will say things, well, goals tell you whether or not you did what you were going to. And a lot of times P's, people with a P in their type code will say, well, goals are great because it gives you something to shoot for. Well, how is it important to reach it? Well, typically people with a J in their type code, well, that's everything. Typically
Yes.
people with a P in their type code, let you know where you're headed.
That's right. Yeah. Well, so what I'm intrigued with is, I think as I'm learning more about this and studying it, is the interaction of, and what I've heard some other practitioners kind of talk about is, if you start looking at a couple combinations. And so one that stood out to me would be sort of like go back to the S and the N, the intuitive, the N, with a T, with a more thinking kind of and that's not what I am. So I don't know that exactly, but I'm thinking there's it appears like there's conflict there. Like, you would want to be intuitive in one sense, but you're still thinking logically. And so tell us about that dynamic, maybe not that one specifically, but just because there's a chemistry here when you start mixing those letters together.
Sure.
And they may affect each other, right? I mean, obviously.
Yeah, that is right. If we had a chance and we were visually, I would chart it all out and show you how the theory works so that your type code is built in a really balancing way. So your type code can tell you something about the number one way you have for taking in information, number one way you have for evaluating that information. And then we can look at the lifespan of how that develops for each particular type code. And you tend to develop that in a balanced way. So when you talk about somebody who is more intuitive and thinking in abstract thought, but connecting it with logic, you'll find a lot of people who end up in many times professorial roles. Like, oh, I'm trying to help you use logic to understand a bigger picture.
Yep.
Or maybe they tend to be like in a lot of research and development. Oh, I have all of these ideas, these intuitive abstract concepts. Ooh, and if I think it through, this is what it would make sense to do to solve this problem.
Yeah.
So that would be how it would partner together.
That's awesome. Very, very diverse. And it's so cool because of the, just not only in my own, my own experience, but just an experience with other people, and so explain to us how you work with a team. You'll come into a group, they're probably a business, or they're working together in some capacity, and you are introducing this to them. Tell us some of the wonderful, fun things that start to happen when people start to grasp that, there are other normals. Like, there's lots of normals here, like that was very powerful for me, but tell us some of your experiences, or what your strategy is looking for when you get back to a group that is now finally starting to figure some of this out.
My favorite thing is when people start pointing and laughing. That's when you know you've hit it. And this is what happens universally every time, because they've already recognized the differences. They don't need a consultant to come in and tell them they're different. They know that. But once they've got a shared language for it, that's the game changer. So things like this regularly happen. I had a client who said, look, I've got this administrative assistant and I'm just ready to fire her. I'm like, oh, well, tell me more about that. And she said, every time I give her a project, she gets started on it, and then all of a sudden she stops the whole thing and sends me an email that I've got to respond to. And I said, well, tell me what the quality of her work is like before you get the email. She says, excellent. It's exactly what we want. And now she's stalling up the whole thing. Well, because she was my client, I knew that she was much more of a big picture abstract thinker. And I knew that she was giving this employee assignments by saying, here's the big picture of what we want. And in her mind, she was offering the support and the freedom to say, I trust you, go ahead and finish the job. But this employee was a real concrete thinker who thought in bullet point
Mm-hmm.
steps, boom, 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 boom. She said, these are the tasks I've accomplished. Now I want to check in, make sure I'm fulfilling my role before I move on to the next one. So as we unpacked what to do, this client says to me, you mean to tell me I almost fired an excellent employee? But yeah, looks like it. She goes, I could spend 40 seconds replying to an email and that's all she needs from me. Yeah, looks like it.
Yeah.
And so when
Wow.
you cross problems that people are having that are personal, for them to be able to get to a quick solution is wonderful.
Yeah, I have to tell a quick story in this because I sense that I was, I was probably that executive going, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Um, at an institution that you and I once were employed by, and I'll be as vague as I can be, but I was really frustrated with a process. Like you have to fill out this form or you have to go through this, process. And I was trying to get my people to do that process, even though I didn't really believe in the process. And that was really, it became problematic because they were like, well, the boss doesn't believe in the product. I'm not gonna jump through that hoop if he doesn't believe in it. And I had one of the employees who it was very different from me. He kind of pulled me aside and said, why are we agonizing over this? I'm like, well, because it's a stupid process and I don't understand it. And we have to fill this form out or we got to do this. He's like, why don't you just fill out the form? I mean, he just stopped me in my tracks. I was like, because see, that form represented something concrete, something very logical that was very vital to another office on campus that like was filled with people who were very procedural, right? And I'm not procedural at all. I'm like, I'm, free bird. I just want to go and hang out in the clouds. And he just stopped me and he said, why don't you just fill out the form? Like, why are you agonizing over the theoretical, basis for why we have to do that? Just do it. Just fill out the form. And so it was really educational. It was just this great concept that I'll never forget. And saying, that process is very important to that office. And it's not important to me. I could care less about the process, but why not just give them their process? And so, you know what I did? I stopped, I confessed, I took responsibility for setting a culture of offense, to basically on a monthly basis, offend these people and drive them crazy because we wouldn't do what they needed us to do. And I just said, from now on, I'm going to be the first one to turn in my form. Like it was the old funny Disney Pixar movie with you got to turn in your paperwork, Monsters Inc. Remember that guy?
Yeah, that's right.
You got to turn in your paperwork. And he was like, I don't want to do that. So I'm, Mike Grabowski or whatever his name is. But like, it clicked for me to say that's the way they think. The organization needs me to do this. And so all I have to do is fill out the form. It takes 60 seconds, just fill out the form. So that's an example, I think, of me realizing at some point in my career that, oh, wow, like not everybody thinks the same way I do. And I'm not to be personally and, like offended. I'll get back to some of my typing when there's disharmony, because that's another aspect for me that maybe, you could help me with. But I'm like, if people are mad at me or if somebody's, that's why I was in such angst over this, because they were really offended that I didn't fill out the form. And I'm going, come on, what's the big deal? Why are you so angry? Because it bothered me that you were angry. That's that, the F in me, the harmony, the feeling sort of side of me wanting everybody to get along and wanting everybody to, but it was really powerful for me to understand that. So,
Yeah.
um, you know, a good amount of our audience, even listening right now, are probably, extroverted, perhaps a little bit intuitive. We're dreamers. This ENFP that you've mentioned, I told you that. And tell us about, maybe take us through just some pitfalls. I think you mentioned it on your website as the dark side of your personality, kind of the blind spots that this particular type, because I sense I've got a lot of colleagues and a lot of friends here who at least understand us. And if you're listening and you live with an ENFP or you are an ENFP, that, this might be helpful for you. But what's the dark side?
Well, Carl Jung would say that he would say shadow, so
Okay.
it is dark. So think about it as moving around your house in the dark at night. The processes that are in your shadow side, you can use them, just like you can walk around your house in the dark, but they're, you're a little slower, a little more awkward. There's different emotions associated with them. You might bang your shin on them a little bit more than you might some of the others. So you mentioned the group harmony. For a lot of ENFPs, that mental process where we want to make decisions based on how it's affecting other people, they tend to experience that in a really critical way. Every type code has a process they experience in a critical way. So I'm not picking on ENFPs by using the word critical. What I want to talk about is the kind of critique that typically comes from an ENFP has to do with that group harmony piece. Critical often of organizations or of processes, like, oh, come on, didn't you think of other people with that? But then the really critical voice tends to be the one inside their own mind, because ENFPs tend to be so rooted in that core values piece and that ability and that commitment and that interested in talking about core values and the things that matter most in the world. When they get caught in that moment, sometimes they can step on somebody else without realizing it, or maybe say a thing that didn't help with the group harmony. And that's when that critical voice shows up in their own head so strong. So if you have ever heard that voice in your head go, oh, come on, Charlie, did you really say that? What were you thinking? Which is kind of the story you just told.
Mm-hmm.
There's a good chance that that's your type code speaking out of that process. And once you can realize that's what's happening, then it gives you a place to put that level of emotion that you can take some off the critique in your own mind. Sometimes even take some of the shame out of it. A lot of times those deep shame experiences we're having are because of however we've translated the experience in our mind. And so once you can figure out what's happening, then you can step back from it, release some of the emotion associated with it, and then just go, oh, okay, this is what I'll do to move forward and to move along.
Yeah. I think along that same line, kind of a cousin phrase, if I could coin that phrase, but like I've learned that it's probably never as bad as I think it is. I think that's part of the ENFP part of me. And I've learned that's a wonderful skill, but I think, talk to me about how that is so therapeutic for me. Like, I don't know if that I put you on the spot here, but like, I remember back to my times of extreme stress, and it just like the world was about to fall apart. And I would go, it's probably not as bad as I think it is. What is that? What is that dynamic to you?
First of all, I would say I don't think that's specific to ENFPs, that would be universal.
Yeah.
That for all of us, when we're under stress, something gets really escalated, and then some other process comes to try to balance it out, and we get wonky. There's a great book about this called Was That Really Me? It's written by a woman named Naomi King, Quenk. But it speaks to that really well. I think one of the things that you're talking about is often when ENFPs are under stress, because they're so good at coming up with options and possibilities, when they're under stress, their brain says, oh, we've got a problem. I'm going to come up with 1 million possibilities, and I'm going to run it till its end. And for whatever reason, we run it in the most negative possible way. I'll tell you the end result. I'm going to have to sell my house, and I'll have to move away from all the people that I love. Okay, well, that was the good possibility creation that you're good at, run amok. So how do we bring it into balance and use it for the good?
Awesome. Hey, that was worth the price of admission right there. Thank you for that. That was awesome. Hey, as we close things up here, this is only just a touch, just a taste of this, this tool, and what a wonderful assessment, and tool that it could be with your groups. And for us as individuals. But why don't you direct us to some resources that you use or that you're familiar with, and where can we learn more? What's the best way to do that?
Sure. I'll point you to some of the resources we've developed first, because if you're local to Northeast Ohio, it's easy access. It really helps to have somebody coaching you on this material, because if you take an online inventory, some of them are very good. For example, I think Charlie and I have talked about 16 personality types. All of that's very good. But when you take an inventory without somebody to walk you through the results and to verify it, you run into things like developmentally in your lifespan. If you took the inventory, you might be registering on the inventory a process you're developing, not the one you're most natural with, but the one you're aware of.
Yes.
Somebody can help you with that. Also, when we're under stress, we tend to show up with different results on the Myers-Briggs, because when you're stressed, you use different processes. And again, the thing that you're aware of is what you answer on an inventory, maybe not what you're most natural with.
I've definitely experienced that. So,
Most of us have.
yeah. And tell us again, just finally here, where can we reach you? If a listener has an opportunity, they'd love to bring you into a situation, with a group or something. Tell us how to get in touch.
ArrantsMcSwain.com, ARRANTS, and then McSwain, MCSWAIN. We do team building workshops, half day, full day. We've also got an online course so that you can sample the material, see what you think, work on it privately, and you can find that on our website under online courses. And in the online course, you also get a free coaching session. So it's not just take the course. You and I will meet and talk through your results.
Awesome. That's wonderful. One last little snippet. I want to give a great plug for a distinctive that you are currently offering. You are doing equine interaction. And tell us a little bit briefly before we let you go, how are you integrating working with animals and horses with clients and the overview of that service?
We're teaching congruent leadership with horses, because for all the things I can teach you very logical information about Myers-Briggs, everybody knows the congruent leaders walk in a room and everything feels better. But those are invisible, intuitive skills, and I can teach those with horses. And that's what we do. We take you to the barn, show you how to communicate with 1,000 pounds, and it's all intuitive. You can find that on our website too.
It reminds me, I've never done it, but it reminds me or makes me think of almost like the horse whisperer concepts in working and learning to work with people as well.
That's right. We do a morning with the horses. So if you want to try that out, you come out in a cohort of 3, you spend a couple hours with the horses. We give you an experience of those intuitive skills. And then we follow that up a week later with a coaching session so that you can make sense of what you learned.
Celia, thank you again so much. It's great to live in the neighborhood with you, and we need to get together more often. But thank you again so much on behalf of all of us listening. Just the introduction to the Myers-Briggs and to your services. What a great thing. Thank you once again.
Charlie. You're a good neighbor. It's good to see you.
Thanks.